Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm very happy to be here. I will be talking about a new love for censorship, how social media and identity politics undermine the fundamental values of democracy. In 2025, in February, US Vice President J.D. Vance used the Munich Security Conference as a platform to denounce Europe's alleged retreat from one of its fundamental values, namely its commitment to free speech. The same month, the Trump administration started limiting access to the White House for journalists, offering the privilege to well-deserving outlets. Since then, journalists have been threatened with lawsuits, and universities have been pressured to comply with the administration's policy by withholding funding. Government programs have been shut down, and during the big delete, websites and documents containing any of the 27 newly banned words have been deleted. In the case of the US, the extent and the rapidity of the actions taken by the Trump administration may surprise, but the underlying rhetoric is shared by others. From Putin to Bolsonaro, and from Marine Le Pen to Germany's AfD, autocrats and extreme right-wing parties have claimed these last years to be champions of free speech, while concomitantly limiting its reach when in power. When the very words we use their meaning, discussions become extremely difficult. This blurring of concepts is one of the reasons why in these last years, progressive young people came to consider that free speech is a formal right that only served the privileged and could therefore be abandoned. In other words, they came to think that other causes, above all diversity, inclusiveness, and minority rights, not only deserved more attention, but to give them priority in case conflicts arose between these competing values. The argument goes like this. In order to increase the autonomy, the equivalent of sovereignty on an individual level, of those considered oppressed, universal principles needed to be left behind and solidarity limited to the members of the in-group. I will try to argue that the identity politics conceived in that way are counterproductive, insofar as they fail to achieve the very goal they proclaim to pursue, that is, a more egalitarian and inclusive society. For that purpose, I would like to start. Yes. I would like to start by taking a closer look at the phenomenon described above, namely the cancel culture originating in American university campuses. I'll then make a short parenthesis to shed some light on the French situation, as I was working as a French professor at the Sorbonne. Before then proceeding to analyze how this new set of ideas and behaviors was born. While I will present several contributing factors, I pay a special attention to the role of social media. So I start with my first point, cancel culture in American universities. In October 2015, Erika Christakis, a lecturer at the Yale Child Study Center and Associate Master of Silliman College, answered an email from the school's Intercultural Affairs Council that had asked students to be considerate of their fellow students' feelings when choosing their Halloween costume. I cite from the email that she sent to the administration and to her students. I wonder, and I'm not trying to be provocative, is there no room anymore for a child or young person to be a little bit obnoxious, a little bit inappropriate or provocative, or yes, offensive? Have we lost faith in young people's capacity, in your capacity to exercise self-censure through social norming, and also in your capacity to ignore or reject things that trouble you? As a reaction, students blamed Erika Christakis to be in favor of racist costumes. A few days later, about 150 students gathered in front of her house and confronted Nicholas Christakis, her husband, of failing to create a safe space for students. On a video that went viral, a student can be seen yelling at Nicholas Christakis, "Who the fuck hired you? You should step down. It's not about creating an intellectual space. It is not. It is about creating a home here." The university didn't fire the couple, but didn't take a clear stand in favor of free speech neither. In May 2016, Erika and Nicholas Christakis resigned from their positions at Silliman College. I picked this incident because it is representative of several changes that affected campus life in the 2010s. What happened when the first members of Generation Z entered university? As the story of the Christakis underlines perfectly, there has been a shift in how students view the very purpose of university. It was no longer seen as a place where ideas can freely circulate and where opposing point of views can be debated in an effort to gain a better understanding of a subject. For an increasing number of students and administrators, the goal of university was to provide a safe space for all students, no matter their cultural, ethnic, religious background or social or sexual orientation. As praiseworthy, the ideal of an inclusive and diverse university is, by making it a combating value of free speech, it led to the idea that students, in order to feel safe, cannot be confronted with any opposing ideas. The underlying assumption is that speech can equal violence. Combating it amounts to an act of self-defense. Unsurprisingly, once these ideas spread campus, actions followed. Deplatforming attempts of speakers in US universities have continuously rose since 2013, reaching an all-time high of 172 in 2024. It is also worth noting that until 2009, disinvitation attempts were evenly distributed among right-wing and left-wing activists. Since 2013, they increasingly come from the left. The College Free Speech Ranking, a survey realized in 2023, including more than 55,000 undergrad students from 254 colleges and universities, shows that these changes had consequences in the climate reigning on campuses. 56% of the respondents expressed worry about damaging their reputation because of someone misunderstanding what they've said or done. And just over a quarter of students, 26%, reported that they feel pressure to avoid controversial topics in their classes. University administrators also participate in the rise of this new culture. By publishing lists of microaggressions, students were encouraged to conceive their relations to others in terms of difference. The underlying standpoint theory goes even further, especially in its popularized version, and proclaims that members of certain identity groups can never successfully communicate their experiences to outsiders. In the end, the unwillingness to discuss opposing views in the name of mental safe spaces doesn't even stop before the dead. According to student demands, reading lists should come with trigger warnings when including authors from the past whose views don't fit today's moral and social views anymore. What is the situation in France? When teaching at the Sorbonne in the summer semester of 2024, I could not help but notice that some students seem to feel personally offended by one of the texts chosen for the compulsory reading. They repeatedly insisted on the right-wing orientation of the author and insinuated that by choosing this reading, I must share his convictions. However, not once did they criticize the author on the grounds of the ideas developed in the text. Left troubled by this experience, I have since conducted a survey of my own. Interrogating my students as well as colleagues and friends in Paris, I wanted to find out if Generation Z is actually does actually have a greater tendency of censoring unpopular opinions. Due to the lack of time before the conference, I wasn't able to gather a sample that is representative of the whole French society. But I think thanks to its focus on the progressive segments of Parisian society, approximately 86% of the respondents declared being left-wing, the survey is still able to give us some insights on the tendencies present in those parts of the population that are probably the closest socially and politically to those of to the students in the US universities. So 30% of the respondents were members of Gen Z, while 42% of the respondents were millennials. What were the main findings? Were there any items showing important generational shifts? No noticeable difference could be found between generations concerning the idea largely supported over 95% by all age groups that free speech is a fundamental right that needed to be accorded to everyone without consideration of person's origin, skin color, religion, or sexual orientation. More surprisingly, only 8% of respondents of Gen Z believe that censorship is limited to authoritarian countries, while 27% of millennials agree or strongly agree with this statement. 3/4 of the respondents in both age groups think that freedom of expression is not always respected in France. When asked for areas and topics where freedom of speech wasn't respected, the largest group of respondents answered that the concentration of media in the hands of the few was responsible for limitations of freedom of speech. The second most cited item were answers concerning equal access of minorities and women, followed by the right to demonstrate limited by the police, violence, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and whistleblowers. When asked if there were areas where they would wish for more limitations of speech, the three main answers were racism, homophobia, and misogyny, 46%, historical negationism, 26%, and social media and disinformation, 20%. Only few respondents of Gen Z, 29, compared to 77 of millennials, consider that public figures have a responsibility and therefore need to be beyond reproach. At the same time, they are more likely than millennials to support public shaming when somebody's actions or speech have been offensive. A final question of the survey asked for their reaction in the case a university, association, or company was organizing an event supporting a speaker that they fundamentally disagreed with. Answers show that millennials have a greater propension in general to act, including preventive action like organizing a counter-demonstration or boycott. Generation Z is slightly more likely, though, to take public action, namely to use social media to find support and put pressure on the organizer. These findings suggest that the trend originating in American universities has not yet fully developed in France, especially the generational shift that is separating millennials and Generation Z in the US seems less marked in France. Although several deplatforming attempts have been made in French universities, they still seem less common than in US colleges and universities. Cancel culture appeared under specific circumstances there. As we will see, not all of the contributing factors apply to the same degree in France. Differentiating a critical culture from canceling. In a democracy, and even more so at university, critical thinking constitutes a major factor of progress. Confronting opposing views is a prerequisite if we want to expand our knowledge. Already in the 19th century, John Stuart Mill had pointed out that an idea that is not frequently and fearlessly discussed will be held as a dead dogma, not a living truth. That is why, before analyzing the origins of cancel culture, it is essential to differentiate these new practices from a critical culture which is at the heart of every academic debate. Author and journalist Jonathan Rauch proposed a cancel culture checklist. Each of the 6 points can be seen as a symptom. The more symptoms are united, the more likely an act can be qualified as cancel culture. The 6 warning signs are punitiveness, so while critical culture would rather try to correct, cancel culture would try to punish, deplatforming, the degree of organization, secondary boycotts, and moral grandstanding. Susan Nocell argues, for example, that an honest call-out should never serve secondary goals like signaling your own virtue before an audience or gathering or building up an online following. And the last point is truthiness. So cancel culture attempts often have little concern for the accuracy of what they are telling. To put it with the words of Andrew Doyle, cancel culture does not seek to criticize, but to punish, and leaves little scope for redemption. So how did we get here? The Great Rewiring of Childhood is the title of a book by the American psychologist Jonathan Haidt. Based on the observation that mental health issues were skyrocketing in schools and universities in the 2010s, he identified the transition from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood as the main reason why Generation Z can be called the anxious generation. Parenting techniques have indeed begun to change from the 1980s on, leading many parents to overprotect their children in the real world. Consequently, children and adolescents today spend less time unsupervised and doing free play, and they have fewer friends. The introduction of smartphones has intensified this trend. While parents are overprotecting their children in the real world, they often underestimate the dangers of online activity. Why are these developments making adolescents and young adults more depressed, and what does it have to do with cancel culture? In order to become resilient adults, children need to be exposed to certain stressors. The reduction of free play and unsupervised activities is harmful because it reduces even those dangers that are stimulating and deprives children of the opportunity to develop important social skills. Only in unsupervised play, children need to negotiate the rules of the game themselves, thus learning to cope with conflict. Replacing playtime with phone time, especially heavy social media use, reinforces these dissocializing tendencies. The main risks are social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, and addiction. Social media as an aggravating factor. Adolescents are highly sensitive to social status and social rewards. With the introduction of the like button on Facebook and other similar features on the other platforms, evaluation processes have been implemented as one of the main functions of social media. Especially young women suffer from the constant comparison with unattainable and highly overrated role models. As social media outlets monetize each user's time spent on their platform, they are designed to capture our attention as long as possible. So-called compulsion loops are created by little hits of dopamine triggered every time we get a like, leaving us craving for more. The algorithmic functioning of timelines adds another layer of addictiveness. It also ensures that more popular posts get more publicity. By rewarding popular posts in this way, the platforms contribute to the spread of false information and extreme positions. An MIT study from 2018 on retweets shows that false news is 70% more likely to be retweeted than truth. In addition, they found that political news traveled deeper, more broadly, reached more people, and was more viral than any other category of speech and false information. A recent study published in Scientific Reports shows that extreme and eccentric posts have a higher probability to obtain likes. The possibility to remain anonymous on the one hand and the necessity to answer posts immediately on the other hand contribute to a lack of nuances and fact-checking. The resulting political polarization helps to further cultivate a climate of distrust and resentment. Political radicalization. When the first members of Gen Z left universities, a short march through the institution, as Yashamon called it in reference to the generation of '68, was sufficient to guarantee a widespread of their ideas. The moment coincided with the first presidential term of Donald Trump, a moment where the political polarization of the country was at its height. Why is this important? Because social psychologists and sociologists like Luis Cosa, or before him Georg Simmel, have shown that groups not only increase the degree of their cohesion, but tend to become intolerant of any kind of internal critique and dissent when confronted with an external enemy. This explains why advocates of the new identity orthodoxy started turning against themselves, and why cancel culture sometimes resembles a witch hunt. Furthermore, identity politics on the left or the right never happen in a social void. They are mutually dependent, or as Hubert Heckmann argues, they are maintaining a relationship of mimetic rivalry. In the light of a second term with Donald Trump as President of the United States, it is ever more important to not let our basic tribal effects guide our actions. Why identity politics are harmful? To set limits on speech in order to improve tolerance is like attempting to extinguish a fire with gasoline. This pointed remark made by Andrew Doyle perfectly sums up the situation. By emphasizing our differences, we are not making our societies more inclusive, but ever more hostile for those who do not detain the power to impose their views. The historical examples to underscore that assertion do not lack. Different identity groups will fight a zero-sum battle for recognition and resources, and the minorities supposed to be empowered will end up being those suffering. Universal rights are often being accused of being too individualistic. Afraid of the responsibilities that any freedom entails, people believe to be able to find empowerment through the affiliation to a group. Modern life can indeed be lonely, even more so if you're part of a minority. But as Erich Fromm already showed 80 years ago, the attempt to return to organic communities and the logic of us and them will only attenuate the symptoms for a while. What can be done? Timothy Garden Ash's advice on the topic is quite straightforward. Rather than encouraging people to be thin-skinned, what we need in a world of increasing and increasingly intimate diversity is to learn how to be a little more thick-skinned, to live and cope with difference. But in order to do so, we need to give the next generation the chance to learn these skills during the important years of childhood and adolescence. If we want to return to a culture in which conflict is seen as beneficial, it is important to ensure that our children grow up to be resilient adults. They only will if they have been given the opportunity to do things on their own in the real world, to interact with others without adult supervision, and to negotiate the rules of their social interactions and games by themselves. As we have seen, this might also entail the necessity to limit and delay access to social media for our adolescents. Especially with regards to new technologies, it is important to remember the difference between autonomy and independence. As the French philosopher Alain Renaud reminds us, the idea of autonomy is not based on that of a self-centered, self-sufficient individual. It implies the consideration of others. But Kant's imperative to universalize the principle of my actions can only work if I am confident that you do the same. This trust has been eroded these recent years and needs to be restored, not only in the real world, but also in the digital. With the rise of AI-driven tools, it is ever more important to build infrastructures that are more transparent and readable by its users. Efforts to decentralize the cyberspace by breaking the concentration of power in the hands of a few could also help to diversify information and opinions. We will never agree on everything, but in an ever more connected world, we should initiate a debate between as many actors and stakeholders as possible to define the conditions in which we can disagree. As Timothy Garden-Ash points out, at scale in Cosmopolis, this work has barely begun.
Thank you very much, Carmen, for this very great and lovely talk on this important topic. So now the room is open for questions. Please don't be shy. Yeah, here's the first one.
So thank you for the really interesting talk. You said, or you made clear that from your little survey, the situation in France is not as severe as in the US, at least at the point time when you made the survey. Do you have any ideas why is that? Is it because of cultural differences, different histories, different how society is shaped in these countries? Have you any ideas on that?
Well, as I said, I think the contributing factors that I've presented, they don't apply to the same degree. First of all, technological advancements always happen, or mostly happen in the US before they reach Europe, and they know a wider spread there than they do in Europe, at least in time afterwards. So we may face the same situation in a few years' time, but for the time being, I think that maybe social media use was not as widespread in Europe at the same point in time. Also, political radicalization. I don't feel like that we have the same situation in France as we have. I mean, you have to look at each country, obviously, but in France, I don't think that the political radicalization is as advanced as it is in the US at the moment. And I think since the new presidential term of Donald Trump, things are even getting worse. I mean, in France, there are elections coming up. We will see what will happen afterwards. Maybe there will be more political radicalization if Le Pen, well, now it's not Le Pen anymore, Bardella wins the elections. We will see. But I feel like, yeah, that's one of the important things. Yeah, these factors can change in time, and we definitely should keep an eye on them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Further questions? It's a long way.
Hi, thank you for the super interesting presentation. I have one point. I'm having difficulty following the argument to the point of identity politics, specifically because my understanding is that any social or moral movement has a necessary dimension of identity politics. If I say I'm a proud European and I equate that with democratic rule of law or liberalism, that's a moment of articulating an identity politic of being a proud European. So if you say there's a punitive dimension to it, or there's an authoritarian dimension to it, that I very much share as a concern, but the necessary connection to identity politics isn't clear to me.
Well, for me, the connection is we can either create a tolerant and open and inclusive society in believing in universal values, or we can create a society in believing that only people of a certain identity should have access to this inclusive society. When we limit it to one certain group, or let's say, yeah, Europeans, we limit it to this group and we exclude others. And I think it is important. The idea of the very base of tolerance and inclusiveness should be that it includes everyone, and it shouldn't be limited to one special identity. So yeah, I think we should go back to the values of let's say, the French Revolution that were based on the idea that human rights were universal and applied to everyone, no matter its origin, no matter its gender, no matter its religion. And, well, at the time, we weren't really talking about sexual orientations, but I guess the idea behind it was that it would apply to anyone and not just to some certain identities. Yeah.
I completely agree with you, but I love the example of the French Revolution. What's the French Revolution without the tricolore? You know, you always have this symbolism that binds identity, that creates a group of shared values, and I completely agree that the difference between an authoritarian or an exclusive value system is one where you say, no, we want specific rights for us and not for others. But for me, that's not a boundary moment between identities. That's kind of a moral value judgment on what this movement is fighting for. My point was, in order to have something like a European pro-democratic movement, that has a necessary moment of identity politics. I think any social movement, any moral movement to create cohesion needs this moment of identity politics. So I'm having trouble saying that this necessary form of social organization is tied to a punitive dimension necessarily or an autocratic dimension necessarily. What I find so interesting in the rest of what you spoke about is how this specific identity moment is then tied to punitive or authoritarian elements. But there's still a disconnect in my mind between the necessity of punitivity and identity politics. I hope I'm more clear this time.
Well, the word punitive, I used it in because I took it from Jonathan Rauch and his checklist of cancel culture. So I wasn't saying that identity politics are punitive, but I do feel that cancel culture is fueled by identity politics, and that in that very special case, it defends a point of view where communication between different groups becomes very difficult because the underlying standpoint theory really thinks that identity groups have special experiences that are not communicable between to outsiders. And I think one of the fundamental values of democracy is dialogue. So if between identity groups there's no dialogue possible, I think we get to the end of democracy at some point.
So I have maybe a question that follows up on this, maybe coming back to the so-called cancel culture. What are the long-term effects on civic trust, do you think, when people feel they must self-censor, even in their own political bubbles?
Very interesting question. Well, I think it comes back to what I just said. It is extremely important in democracy to value different points of views, and if people start to self-censor themselves, we lose access to some point of views. And I think, like, one of the reasons why we defend free speech in democracies is because it is a way to get to truth. That's why it is also especially valued in university. You need opposing point of views to check that you're not wrong, because I mean, if you look at what we think politically today and compare it to what people thought 100 years ago, there are a lot of things that we find wrong in the thoughts and ideas of the people from 100 years ago. We have no guarantee today that what we think will not be judged in the same way in 100 years. And I think, it is important that free speech, and especially unpopular opinions, can circulate, because free speech is no good if it is only there to, for the opinion that is already defended by the majority. It needs only free speech from minorities needs protection. Otherwise, there's no point. I mean, the majority needs no protection to speak their mind.
Thanks. There are any other remaining questions? Yes.
Thank you. I was thinking a bit about the term cancel culture because maybe I have to elaborate a bit. So I'm coming from this fact-checking or the study of fact-checking and study of disinformation, and we had a somewhat discussion about the term disinformation because this whole field really got bigger and bigger in the first term of Donald Trump, and everyone was talking about fake news because he said, well, everything is fake news. And in the first research papers of this period, researchers also used the term fake news until some said, well, maybe this term is too political and it's used for polarization. And then the terms disinformation and misinformation were invented. And I'm thinking a bit about if the term cancel culture is in a scientific context appropriate, or if it's good to use it because I think it also has this huge dimension that people use it in political discussions, both from the left and the right. Yeah, I would just like to hear from you if you have any ideas about that, or what do you think about that, if the term really fits the concept that we want to talk about.
I think you're making a good point. It's probably a term that is already too politicized, and yeah, but I don't know any better term for the time being. So.
Totally understand. I don't know it either, but I just wanted to maybe for all of us raise the question if there is, or if you would say, well, it's not too polarized or politicalized, and it's okay to use it. But I think maybe in a scientific context, we, as a community, should think about inventing another term for that phenomenon.
Yeah, definitely. But I think actually that's one of the problems that we're facing with political radicalization in general, that a lot of terms are used by one political side and sometimes also in ways very far away from the initial sense. So that's what I said in the beginning. Words lose their meaning, and then discussions between people who are coming from different political backgrounds become increasingly difficult because we don't. If we are not agreeing on the terms of the discussion, we don't know what we are talking about.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot for the inspiring talk. When I tie this back to the mainstream topics of this conference, which is cybersecurity and like kind of a little bit the AI topic, right? It's getting complex because if you take social media as one example, you have to filter certain things, I guess. And you can also say that this is a way of canceling a couple of things out in the digital sphere, right? And I was wondering, it's not really like a question, but more like a remark, that this critical culture that you mentioned, if we had more of this, then a lot of the canceling topics would get less importance, right? For example, we talk a lot about bias in AI and so on. Whatever output the AI gives is to be judged critically, right? So in that sense, a lot of concerns that we have, if we look more into education and let's say what you mentioned about from childhood onwards already get accustomed to be critical about things and to debate pros and cons of certain aspects, we would be more resilient to these kind of topics of on the one hand hate speech or social media bubbles and so on, because we would be more aware that there are different views, right? And I don't have to agree with everything I see in social media or that is produced by AI. So just a remark, maybe.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think the two things, canceling and critical culture, are really opposed. And yeah, if we get to increase our critical culture, especially in younger years, I think we are better prepared to not be offended when we are adults, but rather to engage in discussions with people with opposing views.
So I would say one final question.
Thank you. My question would be regarding what you just said at the very end here. How much of this do you think can really be put down to generational differences? Because if we look at critical culture as a term, let's say, I feel like you could just as well make the argument, if we stay in the North American context, for example, that a lot of, especially Gen X men, I'm looking at like, you know, the Elon Musks, the Peter Thiels, the Jordan Peterson of the world, have moved just as far, maybe to another side, maybe you wouldn't call it cancel culture, but they moved just as far from taking other people's points of view seriously and completely, basically, out of hand disregard everything that is opposing their views. And the even bigger question that comes from this, if we now were to agree that that is a process that is happening, isn't this maybe more than just a generational shift, and it might be a cultural shift away from liberal values at large? I'm sorry, that was a big question.
I really don't know what to say. That is, yeah, a big question. I would like to say that I hope not, because I think there's still hope for democratic elements in our society to win this battle. But yeah, it definitely is a battle, and we. That's why I think it is so important that we analyze the different reasons how it can come to that, how people. I mean, I'm just thinking of Adorno and his F scala for like the propension of accepting fascist ideas in the 30s. Well, it's not considered very scientific today, but I think the idea behind it should guide our studies today. We should do more studies to see why people have a propension to adhere to certain ideas that are anti-democratic. Yeah, definitely.